Well, hi, everybody. It's Bill Whittle coming to you from the Infinite Plane of Despair here on the CoronaSphere Lounge. Tonight's episode, as you may have seen, is called The War on Optimism. We've got some interesting statistics out today. In fact, some paradigm shifting reports out there. We don't know exactly how much of this to weigh just yet. The reason I'm doing this, obviously, as I've said before, is to try to provide good news and hopeful news that is well sourced and authentic, and not trying to hide any bad news or anything like that. But today we got some kind of earth-shaking news, really, in a couple of areas. So today's episode is called "The War on Optimism," and let's just talk that concept over real quick. I think there's a difference between being careful and advising people of risks. It's important to advise people of risks. It's important to protect public health. It's important to get people to take things seriously. It's important to do all of these things. But then there comes a point at which, when you are only presenting bad news and any attempt to show any good news whatsoever is stifled, that's when you realize that what's really going on is that our moral and intellectual superiors have decided how scared we should be. And being media personalities, they've decided what's good for us, and therefore they're going to feed us the information, because God knows we're not capable of making up our own minds or coming to our own conclusions. And the reason I call this a war on optimism, as opposed to just simple, straightforward words of caution and seriousness, is that when words of optimism are presented, the media cuts away from them on TV. We saw this just recently. Doctor, I've forgotten her name. I don't have it. Hang on a second. I've got it somewhere. Not Dr. Fauci. Dr. Bricks, who's the White House coronavirus response coordinator, was saying that we still don't have all the data. Needless to say, we are still trying to get everything under control. The social distancing is working, self-quarantine's working. And then she said, however, some of these mortality figures that are being published from Italy and China they're just insanely high. They're just ridiculously high. And she went on to explain why they're ridiculously high. And apparently, CNN cut away. They cut away from her, telling us why those mortality figures are too high. Wow. This goes in line with what we were talking about before. I'm trying specifically to keep this non-political as much as I possibly can. But we have also seen at least calls for people with a certain political agenda are saying that they shouldn't cover President Trump's coronavirus live coverage, because his approval ratings continue to go up. When I say the war on optimism, you're not going to find a better example than the case of the couple that decided to administer themselves some chloroquine in the form of an aquarium cleaner. If you listen to the news reports about that, you will hear a reporter speaking to the woman who her husband, elderly couple, found that there was chloroquine in their aquarium cleaning bottle, so they took it. Nobody really knows how much they took, but the press has turned this into Donald Trump has caused their death because Donald Trump has told everybody to take chloroquine. When you listen to the actual reporter, you can hear him walking this poor woman, who's unbelievably distraught, needless to say, and quite ill. You can hear them walking the woman down the path to say, basically, Donald Trump told me to take this medicine. He said it was safe. And when I say the war on optimism, this is the kind of example that I'm talking about. Forget about the fish story for a minute, because obviously the President of the United States didn't say go out and take chloroquine, and obviously the President of the United States didn't give people dosing advice, and that is what they're reporting. They're saying, based on Trump's recommendations, people went out and drank aquarium tank cleaner. So why is that anything different than just, why is that bigger than just political sniping? Well, it's different because if you listen to the people who are trying to advance that narrative, you will hear time after time saying, well, there's no evidence that chloroquine has any effect on COVID-19 at all. That's just plain wrong. It's not approved. Trump said it was an approved medicine, but it's not approved. Aquarium cleaner is not approved. Chloroquine as an anti-malaria drug has been approved for 70 years. And they know that. They're arguing that it's not approved for treatment with the COVID-19 vaccine. That is was 2-3 days ago. Things are moving so fast. That was undergoing trials in New York at the time. So clearly it's approved for some kind of human work, but nobody's ever said or even implied that you should just go find any bottle that has the word chloroquine or even the letters Q in it and drink every part of it you possibly can. When I say there's a war on optimism, when you hear people saying that there's no evidence that chloroquine is effective against this COVID-19, that's just plain wrong, and that's just plain wrong. And so you have to start asking yourself about the agenda behind what is getting to you and what's not getting to you. Now, with all of that said, we can again go to the spectrum. Anytime you deal with a spectrum of things, it could be anywhere here. There's a lot of unknowns. Just go to the poles, the extremes. Some people say the whole thing is a hoax. It's clearly not a hoax. There's no question that this virus is out there. There's no question that this virus is a killer. We have some information about how much of a killer it may or may not be. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's not a hoax. It's not invented. It's not a creation of the media to the degree that there's not a virus out there called COVID-19 that is causing some people to die. There's no question that that is true. In my mind, you want to think differently, that's entirely your business. And then on the other pole is the narrative that this is like a plague. It's a scythe that's going to cut through the population, and that the only chance we have of surviving as a species, this is how it's portrayed, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here, is to basically prepare to isolate yourself for 18 months. It's going to take 18 months, was the claim, to get this under control. So start planting your gardens now for your fresh vegetables, and when people hear this, they sell their stocks. People don't take a loss. You don't take a loss on the stock market unless you bought high and then sell low. And a number of people did sell their stocks, and a number of people didn't. I was talking with Jeremy Boring today, and he said that what this is an enormous, what the left has, let me rephrase that, what the media has done is they have caused an enormous transfer of wealth from middle class and poor people to rich people. And here's how it works. When the market tanks as a result of fear, and the fear is generated by going to the worst case scenario, worst case example, not providing any perspective, nothing like that, a war against optimism. What happens is that people who have whatever funds they need to retire on in their 401ks or whatever degree it's caught up in the stock market, those people feel, my God, we're going to have to lock down for 18 months, so they sell their portfolios and they take a bath. The people who don't sell their portfolios are the people who have a lot of money and they don't need the cash instantly, so they watch the stocks go down and down and down. And when they're down at the bottom, then wealthy people start buying stocks, and once they start buying, the market goes up again. There are people who've tripled their money in 4 or 5 days. And this is criminally negligent. When the person in charge of the COVID-19 response is on camera saying that yes, it's serious, yes, we have a lot to worry about, yes, the quarantine is working, all of these things, and then goes on to say, but these mortality numbers are just blown way out of proportion. When the news media cuts away from that, then you know that there's a war on optimism. And that's the whole reason I decided to do this show on a daily basis anyways, because nobody's talking about the potential good news. So I'm going to, like I said, try to qualify all this as much as I possibly can and be as upfront and straightforward about it as I can. I just did a show with Scott where he brought a couple of stories into the mix. I had not seen these before, so I just want to say that while I have very high opinion of Scott Ott's accuracy and integrity, he's never invented stories before, and he's turned away many stories that were of questionable source. I haven't seen these reports directly, so there's the qualifier. Apparently, the I forget the name of the service union, the purple and yellow guys. Anyway, the story that I heard, obviously in fragments, is that people were calling around trying to see if they had any of these masks that protect against viral transmissions. And somebody apparently found some, that there were some stockpiled away. According to the story that came to me secondhand, you want to take a guess how many masks they managed to turn up in a warehouse someplace? I think it was SEIU. I think the number was 39 million. That's what I heard. Again, that is not a story I've sourced, but that was what Scott presented to me, that they found 39 million of them. The company that makes the masks says, yeah, we can put out 20 million a week, something like that. And then Joanne Fabrics is giving directions for which materials to buy in order to provide a mask that provides reasonable protection, if not against the viruses themselves and against the spread by aerosol and so on. So there's that. The therapy that I spoke about a couple nights ago, where a person who is recovered from COVID-19 can go down to any Red Cross blood donation center, have their blood strained to remove just the plasma. Plasma infusions rather, are one of the most common emergency procedures, probably the most common emergency procedure. Very, very, very straightforward, very safe. And the report from Johns Hopkins said that immunity, antibodies in the plasma, would be transferred from the donor to the recipient. So instead of a vaccine where you make your own antibodies that target this virus, you'd have plenty of antibodies. They just wouldn't be yours. They'd come from somebody else. When I reported on this 2-3 days ago and read the story from Johns Hopkins at the time of the story 3-4 days ago said, we've submitted the papers to the FDA. We expect the go ahead within 2 to 3 weeks. Well, they got it yesterday. It's 2 to 3 days. None of this is reported. And then, of course, today there's some very, very significant news. And before I get to this significant news, this is, I think I've said this from the beginning too, political opinion is political opinion, and commentary and all that stuff, it is what it is. When we talk about this, we're talking about lives. I'm trying to find stories and a pathway and angles and perspectives that aren't talked about before. But this one I have to get right. I can't get this one wrong. And when I don't know what I'm saying, I need to say I don't know what I'm saying. So with that said, before I talk about this next story, I have heard a number of epidemiologists say, and I think this is exactly right, that right now is the actual danger period, because right now we still don't have any data exactly on how effective the social quarantine has been. We've been in California, we've been in a lockdown for a week almost to the minute. The announcement came during the Stratosphere Lounge of last week. It's recorded at the same time. So we don't know. And as a number of scientists and doctors have said, there is a danger period when the quarantine effects are working and the temptation is to stop them early, and then you undo all of the good that you did. So I just want to be crystal clear on this. I think that's a profound theory. I think when President Trump said he'd like to see the country mostly open for business by Easter, that's another 3 weeks from today, round numbers. We'll have an awful lot more information by then. And again, it's been reported that he said he's going to basically restart the economy. That's not what he said. He said we'd like to, but we'll listen to our advisors. And the anti-optimism narrative has become so intense, so many efforts to make it appear as if the president is going on in defiance of his medical advice, that Dr. Fauci finally had to come out and make a statement and say, these stories about us being at war with the White House are just not true. Please stop. That's pretty much a direct quote. Please stop doing that. We're not at war. He listens to me. He takes my advice. He has other things to worry about besides the medical situation. So please stop making up these stories. Anyway, so all of that said, the social quarantine clearly has some effect, and is a good effect, and it's important. So this is not a call to go running out, and a lot of people are starting to feel that. I think that's way premature. However, this set of stories is really fairly remarkable, honestly. So here's a headline from PJ Media. PJ Media is a right-leaning website, but the headline is just the headline. That's just the one I grabbed. The story is true regardless of who's carrying it. And here's the story. Oops, scientist who predicted apocalyptic coronavirus death rates just walked back his prediction. And here's some of the direct quotes from not from the PJTV article, but from the statement made. So a scientist named Ferguson, I think it was Niall Ferguson, I'm not sure, but he said basically several weeks ago, it was Ferguson's report from Imperial College, which the White House and other officials took seriously, and that report said that if the United States and the United Kingdom did not shut down for 18 months and isolation measures were not taken, quote, we would expect a peak mortality, daily deaths, to occur after approximately 3 months. His model showed overflowing hospitals and ICU beds. Quote, for an uncontrolled epidemic, we predict critical care bed capacity would be exceeded as early as the second week in April, with an eventual peak in ICU or critical care bed demand that is over 30 times greater than the maximum supply in both countries. That would be the US and the UK. Dr. Deborah Birx, who the White House coronavirus response coordinator, reportedly said that the administration was partially focused on the Imperial College's report's conclusion that entire households should stay in isolation for 14 days if any member suffered from COVID-19 symptoms. What they're basically saying here is that the scientist's initial model and his report is the report that basically caused the entire world to just go, holy cow, we've got to lock this whole thing down. And so that was the report from several weeks ago, and that's the information and the data that not just the United States, but the UK and other countries were going under. Here's what came out today. This is the direct quote from Ferguson. This is not the quote from the PJTV article. The Ferguson press release says the UK should now be able to cope with the spread of the COVID-19 virus, according to one of the epidemiologists advising the government. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London gave evidence today to the UK's Parliamentary Select Committee on Science and Technology as part of an inquiry into the nation's response to the coronavirus outbreak. He said that expected increases in National Health Service capacity and ongoing restrictions to people's movements can make him reasonably confident the healthcare service can cope with the predicted peak of when the predicted peak of the epidemic arrives in 2 to 3 weeks. UK deaths from the disease are now unlikely to exceed 20,000, he said, and could be much lower. He says not likely to exceed 20,000 and could be much lower than that. But the thing that bears mentioning is his initial report, the report that caused all of this lockdown, all of it, was that he has estimated, I believe the number was 500,000 dead in the UK. So we went from a computer model that predicted 500,000 dead in the UK and the medical system completely overwhelmed, to a report that now says he's claiming that 20,000 would be the top end and might be considerably lower than that. Now, there's quite a big difference between 500,000 and 20,000. It's a significant difference. It's more than 21, 25 to 1, something like that. This is not a trivial oversight. So if the person who is, I've heard a number of people who have been saying this, been basically coming off of this, and virtually all the media stories I see are saying things like, expect this lockdown to last 18 months. And so when the President of the United States comes out and says, no, we'd like to be back in business by April, when the news is reporting that it's going to be an 18-month lockdown based on this report, and the stock market crashes, and then the President of the United States, surrounded by people who seem to be competent, and people who watch the President's briefings become more impressed every day that they do seem to know what they're talking about. When a day or two ago the President says, no, we think we might be able to be open by Easter, the stock market goes right back up again. The President has two responsibilities. He has the responsibility for minimizing preventable deaths, and he has the responsibility for making sure that the economy doesn't die. And despite how frequently it was mocked, the first rule of medicine and the first part of the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. And it is possible to have a cure that's worse than the disease. He's been vilified for saying that. But he said it'd be nice if we got things back going by April. If this data is true, if the revision is correct, and if the expected mortality is 20 or 25 times, not 20 or 25%, 20 or 25 times lower than what we were initially led to believe, then certainly any risk-reward calculation has to rebalance itself on the basis that the risk is now 25 times smaller than it was before by the same guy who made the initial risk assessment. So we don't know. We don't know. And it's clearly better to err on the side of caution, but we're at the point now where erring on the side of caution may mean erring on the side of, no, the economy is the bigger crisis now than the virus is. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that's something that certainly should be considered. Now, I have another graph here that's based on actual data, but graphs and statistics can be very misleading, as our irreplaceable Lord Bios, who's been constantly keeping me out of the reefs over the course of the last week, points out. There's so many different problems with methodologies and so on. So I'm going to show you a chart based on compiled actual data, and then I'll tell you why this chart may not be as good as it looks, and then I'll tell you why it may be. Okay, so here we go. This is a compilation of COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 population. So this is essentially a per capita look at how many people are dying. There's the number of people that die per 100,000 cases. And the report is staggered in such a way so that even though various countries have gotten the disease at various times, they have tried to create an artificial starting point. And that starting point is when 100 cases in the country have been reported, that's when the clock starts. I think that's a really smart metric to start on. If your first case comes in and that person sits in a hut and doesn't spread anything, you don't know. But once you've got 100 cases, the thing is more or less out of the bottle. So what this chart shows is how many people per 100,000 have died 19 days after the 100th case has been reported. Now, Spain is well past 19 days, and China's way, way past 19 days. But this is a way to kind of back up all of the trends to the same starting point, and that starting point is the 100th case reported. That's when the clock starts ticking. Now, what this chart shows is pretty remarkable. You can see that Spain has 3 per 100,000, Italy 2, Netherlands on day 18, that's 1 day short, 1.6. And you look all the way down, the USA is just above Germany, way, way down there. In other words, if you look at these countries, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, Iran, UK, France, South Korea, Germany, somebody can do the math on it. But the United States population is, it's not equal to all of them combined, but it's not awfully far from it. The United States has 300 million people. Italy has 30, I want to say, somewhere in that neighborhood. So we have a much, much larger population, and if you're looking at the total number of cases, we have a lot of cases, and today we became the leading, most cases in the world were in the United States now, and so on. But on a per capita basis, this is the death rate. Now, as Glenn Reynolds pointed out, there's a lot of stuff that can be hidden in here, and this news may not be as good as it may seem. For example, The argument would be that Spain and Italy numbers are very high because they don't have the same level of intensive care per person that we do in this country. There are more intensive care beds in the United States per person, not in whole numbers, per person, than there are in Spain and Italy. And you would think, well, maybe that's the solution, but it's possible that as this disease progresses, once we exceed our capacity, then the mortality rates really shoot up. So basically, that's like saying we have a higher bar than the rest of these countries do. But once it crosses that bar, if it does cross the bar, the mortality rate goes right up, and and I don't have the source on the information. I'm sorry, I should have gotten it, but I don't have it. But it is compiled from data. I'm assuming it's World Health Organization data, but I'm not sure. So it's possible that these numbers for the U.S. are artificially low, that we will exceed our capacity to deal with the cases, and then the mortality rate will rise. But I suspect that's probably not the case. I did see briefly a report in the New England Journal of Medicine, a report that was co-authored by Dr. Fauci, that basically said that looking at the mortality numbers as they come in now, and the mortality numbers start out high because you have a very small base. If you have 100 people and two of them are sick, if two of them die, have 100 people who are sick, two of them die, you've got a 2% mortality rate. But if you have 1,000 people out there who are untested, and they have no symptoms or light symptoms, but they've been exposed to the disease, now your mortality rate is 0.2%. And so there's so many loose ends and variables. We have very sketchy data to begin with, but clearly, the initial mortality estimates, both of the computer model and all the rest, are much higher than what they're turning out to be. If the man who predicted the 18-month lockdown, if that gentleman, Dr. Ferguson, is correct, and he says 20,000 is likely to be the maximum for Great Britain and might be significantly lower, then that goes to the report that I saw in the New England Journal of Medicine from Dr. Fauci, where they basically have decided, I don't know if it's so much a concrete category, but they have reassigned COVID-19 to a lower risk disease, moved it out of the realm of SARS and MERS. SARS had a mortality rate, I want to say 8 to 12%. MERS was 30 to 40%. They are moved it down into the general range of influenza. But I might point out, just as a matter of hope, again, this is no reason to go out and lick doorknobs and all the rest of that stuff. But if it turns out that it is significantly lower, as Dr. Ferguson says it might be, than 20,000 in the UK, then COVID-19 may in fact be roughly equivalent to seasonal flu. It may in fact be lower than that. I'm not entirely sure. We are in a dangerous time now because now we've been locked down for a while. People are getting antsy. People are starting to loosen up. There are plenty of reasons why this may not be true. And anybody who understands how wars work understands that that just because things look good doesn't mean they are good. But it's better to look good than to look bad. And all across the board today, things seem to be looking much better. Now that could be an ambush. I mean, it really could be. And in terms of the ambush of the virus, it could be that we see all of this relatively good-looking news. We put all of these restrictions that we put into place, we let them go. And then a massive infection occurs after we had it more or less under control. That's a possibility. But that's not the kind of question I can answer. The kind of question that I can answer is why does it seem to me that the war on optimism is greater, far greater than is necessary in order to provide an adequate sense of warning and a sufficient level of alarm in order to make the kind of changes that we've been through in the last couple of weeks. I have seen people, most clearly with the argument about the chloroquine. I've seen people who, this is my take on it, there's no evidence for this, just a feeling, but I've seen people who genuinely seem to be disappointed that people are not dying in the numbers that they hoped that they would. And that comes almost exclusively from political commentators, but I've seen it, and so you have to ask yourself if there is in fact truth for this. There there are to me it is inconceivable. I simply have no other explanation for it. If CNN cuts away from the person in charge of controlling this epidemic, who has qualified everything that she said and has been absolutely clear about everything, if she gives a piece of good news and CNN decides that we got to get out of here before that good news gets out, before she finishes her sentence, then something is on. And and I suspect that this is going to be a big reckoning when this is over. There's an awful lot of different psychologies at work here. There's a psychology of people who feel they're in control of their lives and people who feel that they're not in control of their lives. If you feel like that you need government to take care of you and that you can't really take care of yourself on your own and that you're just part of a giant collective, you feel less empowered than you do if you're an individual and you feel like I have a large amount of control over my own destiny. So that's a big part of it. So the people who want to be scared are scared, and the people who want to be optimistic are optimistic. I think it's breaking right down that kind of psychological schism. And so we have this emotional spinning of data, and we have not been able to take a really good look at the data. But one of the things that led me to believe that what I've just said is primarily true, that these numbers are overstated significantly in terms of this, is that 5 or 6 days ago, I was talking about, and I was looking at the difference in the death rate between Italy and Germany, and it was just absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. Italy was crazy high, and Germany was crazy low, and you can't justify that kind of a difference because Germany has a better healthcare system than Italy. It does, and the Italians like to hug and kiss with greetings and stuff. The Germans not so much. And so that's partially explaining it, but you couldn't explain these kind of numbers. Two orders of magnitude difference. And when you find out that in Italy, if a person has a heart attack and dies of a heart attack, but they test positive for COVID-19, then that's counted as a COVID-19 death. But in Germany, which seems much more reasonable to me, they're trying to say, no, this death wasn't caused by COVID-19. Then you get these enormously divergent mortality rates, and how they count the mortality is the only thing that can explain those kind of numbers. So if all of the low end numbers are coming back from countries that are only counting diseases, if the low numbers are coming from the countries that are counting COVID-19 as the clear exclusive cause, then the numbers are much lower than we've been led to believe. I got a question in the comment section. How do I feel about the peak prosperity guys now? A friend of mine recommended I listen to them. I did listen to them. I've been watching the numbers. I was very alarmed. I'm still alarmed. But some people are in the disaster business. Now, I want to be crystal clear about this too. I think there are people who genuinely believe that these alarm bells need to be rung because they genuinely believe that this is a worldwide pandemic, and I'm not saying it's not. But there are some people that are clearly selecting the news. They're selecting what to see, and they're making sure you don't see anything that runs counter to the worst case scenario. I guess that's what really all I want to say, is that there seems to be just a complete blackout on news that runs contrary to the worst case scenario. So I don't know. But I do know that when the president said that it looks like we might be able to be more or less, hopefully we'll be more or less back in business in 3 weeks, stock market goes up. And that's because people go from being overly fearful to being hopeful. Now, you don't want to be overly hopeful, but hopeful is better than fearful. I thought I'd end this edition of the CoronaSphere Lounge with a comment that came from Instapundit, the blog father, the father of us all. I wouldn't be here without Glenn Reynolds, and said it many times. I can't say it often enough. I didn't even read the original source article, but this was a comment from his stream. There is one profanity in it, which I will not speak, but it is printed, so if you've got kids handy, you might want to close your little eyes. And this is just a guy. This is just an American citizen with an opinion, but I thought it was really, really quite good. Oh, by the way, in the show also, I heard that Dyson, the guy who manufactures the terrific vacuum cleaners, says he can put out 10,000 ventilators a week, and he's going to donate the first 5,000. Other companies, GM said, well, we never made ventilators before, but the units we use to heat and cool our seats could be turned into ventilators. How many do you want? Nothing has impressed me more than the absolute speed that the reinforcements have arrived with. The chloroquine, to me, just seemed like a miracle, gift from heaven. Still haven't found out how effective it is, but it's not ineffective. And then instantly, just like mushrooms, you go out the next morning. Where'd these things come from? Everywhere. People are chipping in with non-trivial help. It's not like, hey, here's a nice gesture. No, how many do you need? We can do 10,000 respirators a week. Raise the bar. Don't just flatten the curve. Raise the bar that you got to keep the curve under. With all that said, here's that Instapundit comment that I liked so much. I'll just read it to you verbatim. A guy named Bart Hall posted this, and if you're listening, I'll just read it to you. Truckers are saying, F the log rules, I'm hauling. Presumably the log rules mean they can only drive so many hours or whatever, but the truckers are just saying, to hell with it, I'm hauling, and they're getting supplies to the stores. People are stocking the shelves all night and letting old people shop first. Folks are buying meals for truckers who obviously can't go through the drive-through windows, asking them what they want and then buying it for them. Carnival Cruise Line has told Trump we can match those big Navy hospital ships with some fully staffed cruise ships for isolation and quarantine and treatment. GM and Ford have said, hold our cars and watch this. We can make ventilators where we were just making car parts starting next week by re-engineering seat ventilators, which their engineers hacked together for a new purpose, and they did that in under a week. In a project with which I'm loosely associated, meaning the commenter, Bart Hall, a very effective agricultural disease control agent was repurposed and relabeled specifically for coronavirus control by the FDA and EPA in under 10 days from initial request to distribution. Restaurants and schools have said, we've got kitchens and staff. We can feed the poor kids who used to have school lunch. NBA basketball players have said, hold our basketballs while we write checks to pay the arena staff out of our own pockets. We're going to pay the people that clean the seats in the arena. Construction companies are saying, here are some high-end masks for medical staff and doctors. We use them for painting or for whatever. They're effective. Here you go. Just take them. Distilleries are making sanitizer out of distilling heads and tails, which are normally discarded. That'd be like discarded chemical elements. That's nasty stuff to drink, but it's an effective sanitizer. I love this one. People are tipping grocery clerks, checkout clerks, and handing them let me just try that again. People are tipping grocery checkout clerks and thanking them for taking the risk to be on duty. Local, state, and governments are taking control of everything that the feds cannot do. Some are doing it wrong, but for the first time in decades, they're doing it. Federalism, that's the idea that the states can manage their own business and the federal government only handles the stuff that they can't handle. Federalism is reemerging, and the smallest unit of government is the individual and the family. The single greatest impact on this disease has come from the smallest governmental unit. This is me ad-libbing here, and that's the family. We've decided to stay home. We've just decided to stay in. Some cases in California, we were told we need to stay in, but there was never anybody going down the streets with rifles pointing at our doors, is the point I'm trying to make here. He goes on to say, as Japanese Admiral Isakuro Yamamoto said after Pearl Harbor, I feel all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. I sense that this has just happened. We have a wonderful country, the greatest single force for good in all human history. We've closed our borders with good reason, yet we have top medical people now assisting North Korea in their response to the virus. Many things have been reset, and it will never be the same. By microbiological accident, we are living in profoundly transformative historical times. And to that I say, amen, brother. The changes that will come from this country, I think, are going to be universally good. First and foremost will be a much, much, much greater preparedness for these kind of outbreaks in the future, and that's simply the first and most obvious one. I think when it's all said and done, large numbers of people will realize that they like working from home, and large numbers of business owners will realize that there are some advantages to that happening as well. This whole California AB5 bill, where independent contractors are trying to be eliminated, this may completely not only undo that, utterly reverse it. People may decide they like being independent contractors working from home. Businesses would certainly like that too. Despite the fact that we have 3 million unemployment claims in this week and are likely to go to 4 or 5 or maybe 6 or 7 next week or the week after that, the stock market has gained 2,000 to 3,000 points in the last couple days because people feel optimistic. They feel optimistic because certain people have decided they're going to circumvent this war on optimism, and they're going to use the facts, and they're going to try and do what leaders should be doing, and that is giving people reasonable hope. One of the reasons that Winston Churchill began his prime ministership, he became prime minister the day that France fell. The biggest army in Europe, biggest air force in Europe had just surrendered to the Germans. That was the day he became prime minister. He began his rallying of the British people by saying, I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He didn't say everything's going to be fine. He didn't say, hey, nothing to worry about. He said, we have nothing ahead of us but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And that gained him credibility. He'd always had the credibility. He was one of the few people throughout the entire 20s and 30s who was saying, this guy's a bad guy and we've got to deal with him now or deal with him later. It'll be worse later. But Churchill gave his people hope, and they rose to the occasion. I did a segment called The War President, where I think that Donald Trump, to me, is clearly becoming he's becoming a statesman rather than just a swamp-draining politician. I was happy for that, but he seems to be rising to the occasion. As a general rule, the population is rising to the occasion. Governors are saying the president's doing a good job. President's saying the government's doing a good job. Obviously, there's still political haggling going on. I think that all of that appears revolting now, regardless of whose side you're on. When Nancy Pelosi holds up a bill because it doesn't have enough either abortion funding or enough restrictions on air travel carbon emissions, that's revolting. When Republican congressmen sell their stocks based on inside information given to them in a secret briefing, that's revolting too. I think that this whole thing has had a tremendous, I don't want to say cleansing effect, because I just don't like that term, and people have died, and more people will die from this. But it has had a clarifying effect, and has shown us many things. And I think I'll close with simply this. In spite of the war on optimism, I have never seen a culture step up the way that we've stepped up, especially in the amount of time we did, and especially coming from a start of such softness, of such privilege, of such comfort. No, the American people have stepped up. Uber's not charging for deliveries. They could triple their price. Banks are saying if we have to reduce or suspend mortgage payments, that's what we'll do. All of it is just wonderful. And if it turns out that a 25th of the number of people that we were afraid might die will die, instead of harping on whether we should have listened to this model or that model or whatever, why don't we just say that if this turns out to be true, then that's nothing but great, 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 great news. If it turns out to be true, that's great news. We ended up responding to a threat that wasn't as great as we thought it was, and we mitigated that 25th number significantly, and we're not out of it yet. But This country runs on optimism. That's the fuel. That's the American fuel. And it's not a coincidence that we have the largest economy in the world. We have a quarter of China's population. We produce 4 times what they produce. And those numbers are going to change in our favor dramatically after this is over. That's because we're not run on order or fear or quotas. We're run on optimism. We run on initiative. And we run on the fact that somebody can say, hey, I make scuba gear. It's just what I do. But if I put this valve on top of this thing, it seems to work, and I've got a doctor friend who's advising me, and maybe we could make 10,000 of these things available in the next 3 days. That's what it's about. So I suspect that when it's all over, we're going to see a much, much more streamlined society and a much more fragmented society. I don't mean fragmented politically or morally or spiritually. I think that this virus has helped push us into the information age that's coming anyway. And the information age is a gig-based economy where people have multiple sources of income, and they're working from their own homes, and they're free largely of unions, and they're free of centralized government because they don't need it anymore. Centralized government, trade unions, income tax, mass transit, public housing, these are all second-wave industrial era artifacts. This country was founded on a set of political beliefs and economic beliefs that suited an agricultural nation. And then as we got into the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, as the Industrial Revolution started to take hold, we had to make a lot of changes to that country in order to accommodate cities and the massive influx of people to cities. And now the information age says that really not much difference if the person who I'm working with on the computer is in the next room or across the planet. It doesn't really matter. And we're learning this lesson rapidly now as people are working from home and working fairly efficiently. So I'll just close with one thing about this. Hi. Thank you. We're very good. Thanks for being there. Got a mask and rubber gloves on, and she's cleaning up the offices. God bless that woman. I just keep coming back to this story because to me it's the whole nutshell. It's a whole ball of wax. Fortunate enough 2 years ago now, I guess, to fly out and spend several hours on board USS Spruance. It's a Arleigh Burke-class Navy destroyer. And because I had a little knowledge of it, I got a chance to ask some questions of the executive officer, and he doesn't usually get questions quite so focused, so I had a chance to talk a little bit. And he said, I asked him, are you worried about the Chinese? He said, well, they're building 3 or 4 or 5 destroyers for every one we build. That's something to be worried about. That's a concern. He said, but I'm not worried about them in terms of being a threat to our Navy. I said, well, why not? You say they're building 5 destroyers for every one of ours, and they're newer destroyers. He said, during World War II, the U.S. Navy lost a lot of people. They lost 4,500 people at Guadalcanal, while the Marines lost 1,300. They lost almost triple what the Marines lost, and that's not to minimize the Marines in any way, but the Navy took a beating out there in the Pacific. And this executive officer told me, he said, the major lesson that we learned from the Pacific War, we were far, far better at damage control than the Japanese because we had more initiative, and more of our kids had been building motors and fixing mechanical stuff their whole lives. But what the Navy came out of World War II with was the realization that damage control had to be holistic. It had to be built into the ship. What they found was they went into the war with damage control specialists, teams of people who were basically trained to fight fires and fix flooding, and that's what their job was. And they said that time and time again, this is the exec on the Spruance now. Spruance was one of the guys who won that war. Said that time and time again, looking back at what had happened, the damage control team might be killed in the initial bomb blast or the torpedo explosion, or they're cut off from the fires or the flooding. They simply can't get there because of damage and so on, and we lose ships that way. And this officer said to me that every single person on this ship, from the people that do the laundry and the people that peel the potatoes to the captain and myself as executive officer, Every member of this crew is well trained, is an expert in damage control. We all know how to put out fires. We all know how to stop flooding. We all know how to put on the hoods. We all know how to do all of this stuff. Every one of us is a damage control specialist. And while it's coordinated by a damage control officer, we don't have to wait for a team to arrive. If a fire starts here, we put it out because we know how. Because we train our people and we trust our people. He said that during exchanges with the Chinese Navy, kind of these courtesy exchanges, they would occasionally tour a Chinese destroyer. Chinese would occasionally tour the American destroyer. He said that when the Chinese did come aboard, every single time, 2 of 3 of them accidentally got lost from the tour and somehow found themselves trying to get into the Combat Information Center and see other secure areas, and we just politely reminded them that the tour guide is over here and you're supposed to follow him. But he said that the Chinese cannot do this. And I wanted to be clear about this. I said, are you saying they won't do it? He said, in my opinion, they can't do it. This business of taking every individual crew member as a damage control specialist, they can't. They don't trust their people. They are an authoritarian society. And what we've seen from this is an outbreak of an authoritarian regime that lied about everything and continues to lie about it today, has unleashed upon the world an event, and regardless of how severe it is, because we still don't know the answer to that, the response of free people in an open society who are not compelled to do anything, the generosity and the kindness and the respect, the obedience to reasonable public health measures, voluntary obedience to these things, but especially this burst of individual initiative. I make paint shakers. That's what we do. But we took a look at one of these respirators online, and we realized we can make one. How many would you like? If you just tell us to go, we'll start putting out 20,000 of them next week. I'm not aware of that happening anywhere else in the world. Certainly not happening in China. It's just not. So every day we get deeper into the information age, and every day we get closer to what we're good at. Turns out that what we're good at is crisis management, and the reason we're good at that is because this country's based on optimism. I personally am tired of the war against optimism. I respect and continue to respect the severity of this, and I continue to want to err on the side of caution. And if I had to make a decision about something, I would do the careful thing for as long as I possibly could. But ultimately, the reason I'm doing this show is because I believe that you're not children. I don't think you're children. I don't think you're incapable of making your own decision. I don't think you need to be told how scared to be. I think you just need to get all the facts. And that means the good facts as well as the bad facts. And once that happens, you're able to make your own decisions, just like adults in a free country would do. And that seems to me to be the great takeaway from this so far, is what this country's capable of when you take the brakes off. When you untie the hands that you've tied behind your own back, watch out, something to see. That'll do it for this edition of the CoronaSphere Lounge, made possible by the members of BillWhittle.com. We've had quite an influx of new members lately, for which we are extremely grateful and very, very, very happy to have you. But we all hold a very special place in our heart for the longtime members who've been keeping the lights on here from the beginning and who have continued to support us. And we are very, very grateful and very proud to be able to present some good news and some perspective that maybe not be out there otherwise. So anyway, that'll do it for episode 7 of the CoronaSphere Lounge. We will be back with episode 8 tomorrow, Friday. And for those of you watching live, we're about to go into the Stratosphere Lounge as soon as I close this show out and record it, and off we go. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow right here on the CoronaSphere Lounge.